Good morning, everybody. Think about one of your recent strategy meetings. How did you talk about geopolitics? How did you talk about geopolitical tensions? If you step into any boardroom this year, the mood will be unmistakable. Many things that we took for granted, global reach, reliable partners, steady supply chains, they seem to be very uncertain. Uncertainty is a big topic right now, particularly in the context of global resources. Decarbonization, the clean energy transition, we just heard this, is driving the demand for critical minerals, but also digital and AI and defense are driving demand up and up and up, whereas supply is faltering. This is already creating an intense situation. And circular economy is not just an environmental solution to that, it's also a strategic buffer. And that strategic buffer is a topic that we want to unpack today as part of this panel. So welcome to our panel, and thank you to the panelists for joining this discussion. We will talk about the circular economy as a strategic response to geopolitical tensions. So again, a quick round of applause for our panelists.
We haven't done anything yet.
All right, geopolitical tensions, a new situation. Benedict, looking at the current situation, how is that different? What is really different compared to the recent decades?
So I guess the key difference really is that the few certainties that we've had over the past decades, they've all evaporated. We're really operating under maximum uncertainty. And in that maximum uncertainty, there is only one certainty, and that is that we are massively vulnerable. We are vulnerable as societies, as economies, and as democracies. And you've mentioned, two important words, strategic buffer, strategic response. We believe at the Munich Security Conference, great conference by the way, not quite as good as DLD, but we're getting there slowly but surely. We believe it's much more than a response. It's an imperative. It's an absolute imperative to think about the circular economy in terms of geostrategic uncertainty. And as you said, let me just unpack this for you. If you believe my starting point that we are vulnerable, then I think the right response is to sort of look at your dependencies, look at your vulnerabilities, identify them, and then try to reduce them. And you can reduce dependencies, cluster risks, in sort of two ways. You can find alternative supply chains, both at home and abroad. Abroad means new alliances, new partnerships, less dependence on China and other troublemakers. And at home means circularity. Both are super slow, but one is a lot more promising than the other. And then there is this sort of add-on. The second way to reduce dependencies is to find other materials, other ways to produce the same things with different ingredients, which obviously is also slow. So if you remember only one thing from the answers I'm going to give today is that all the options on the table are incredibly complex, incredibly difficult, and super slow, so you better get started now.
Thank you very much. And looking a bit, yeah.
They're allowed to clap, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it's an extreme situation of uncertainty. And looking a bit into the underlying interests that drive that, do you believe that this situation is something short-term, or will this last for a couple of years? What's the perspective on time dimension?
See, there is, in sort of my world, there is this debate ongoing whether what we're seeing right now is a new normal or the return to the old normal. And I'm very much of the opinion that we're returning to the old normal, where transactionalism and realist policies are driving geopolitics, which means this is nothing that will disappear. Everything that can be weaponized will be weaponized. Every vulnerability that we have will at some point, whether it's in 1 year or 10 years or 100 years, will be abused. And hence it is in our own interest, as Germany, as Europe, as Western liberal democracies, to get our act together, prepare, and not fall prey to the temptation to believe that this is going to be over anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So the World Resources Institute, I think is already talking since more than 20 years about resources being strategic, not just a sustainability priority. Okay, we just heard that security risks and geopolitics are increasingly tied to raw material dependencies and availability. How are you thinking about this? What's the perspective from you on this situation right now?
Yeah, sure. I can maybe give a quick recap of how did critical minerals, raw materials became such a hot topic all of a sudden these years. To me, I think a cornerstone event was when the International Energy Agency published a report back in 2021. And that report gave 2 alarm bells. First is that if we need to achieve the clean energy transition goals, we need massive amount of critical minerals and need a lot of them, 4 to 6 times more than now. And the second alarm bell is that the supply chain of these minerals are highly concentrated. Both mining and processing are concentrated in just a couple of countries. So this report came in the backdrop when the US and China has been in trade war already for a couple of years, right? The 2 mega powers have been exchanging trade restrictions in the field of semiconductor and critical minerals. And 2021, the world is going through the pandemic. People have seen supply chain disruption as never before. And 2022, the Russian-Ukraine war started, and Europe was traumatized by high energy price from the energy dependency. So under those, the timing of this report made these 2 alarm bells really well heard. So the issue of the concerns over critical materials quickly escalated, and it became a national security issue. So in 2022 and 2023, we saw a flurry of critical raw materials strategy in different countries passed. The EU passed Critical Raw Materials Act at a breakneck speed, record speed. Importing countries start to onshore production, so bringing production back home, friendshore production, so sourcing from friendly, likely-minded countries. Companies and countries started talking, opening back doors for deep sea mining, right? All sorts of things happening. And then early this year, the US-Ukraine critical minerals deal really made critical minerals and rare earth elements household terms. And those drivers now have gone far beyond clean energy transition, also to semiconductor and defense.
All right. And looking into this, we see a lot of opportunistic behavior also happening right now. A lot of bilateral deals being made. This uncertainty is also being used very strategically, opportunistically as a negotiation tactic. So from a global perspective, do you believe that we're moving already into a situation where circularity is part of a systemic solution? Or do you think we're very far away because this is very opportunistic and short-term of how this is currently being exploited?
Yeah, so my role at World Resources Institute, I lead on energy, minerals, and circularity. So we work on both responsible mining and scaling circularity. You will see in the critical minerals discussion, I think 80%, 90% of the attention and effort is still on primary production, is still on mining. How can we do more mining faster? And we're trying to shout, we also need to do it responsibly, right? Only a very small part of attention comes to circularity, and it's focused on recycling. And people still often think, okay, recycling is important, but it's something 10 to 15 years from now, because we don't have enough volume yet. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to advance understanding of the role circularity can play to solve this dilemma.
All right, good, super. I think we go a little bit deeper in a second on that. So this is very much a global perspective. And I think the interesting point is that, going beyond the country level, looking just into very big organizations, big corporations, they have international footprints. Let's try to break it down, looking into a specific industry. And then the situation obviously depends on specific material flows, specific geographical footprint, that you have as an industry or as an organization. And Glenn, I was wondering how you look into this. How are you actually, from an industry perspective, reshaping supply chains and production systems in order to de-risk that situation that you're facing?
Yeah, I think de-risking is probably the right word to be using as opposed to decoupling. And I mean, having listened to what Benedikt said here, I think there are two sides to the equation. The first is the automotive industry is a very global business, and it is turned extremely international. And if you look at the value flows and the value chains, they are extremely intertwined, right? The largest market for the BMW Group and for German automotives is China, by far. Largest market in terms of passenger car vehicles. It's the largest market for electric cars. If you look at our employment base, over 50% of all of our BMW associates are based in Europe, right? So we're fundamentally a German, a European-driven corporation. And our largest plant is in South Carolina, in Spartanburg, right? And half of the vehicles that we sell in the US are produced in the US, so that helps, right? So production following the market has always been a principle that we have, and that helps us, that makes us resilient. The question now is really, do you need to be going deeper into the value chain? Do you need to be localizing your supply chains? And you use the word weaponizing, and I think that's one dramatic way of looking at it. But if you think about it,
professional problem with me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but if you look at it, the ingredients that you need for the car of the future, the raw materials, the cobalt, the lithium, the semiconductors, even the information or data, that is all part of this global conflict that we have right now. So our philosophy is for the critical areas, like the battery, to do local for local, to have a Chinese value chain, to have a European value chain, to have a North American value chain. Now with the US and divisions with Canada, that's also a challenge, right? So I think it's a two-sided equation. On the one hand, the automotive industry will always be global, and that's, I think, the advantage of the German industry, that we are global in terms of our thinking. And Germans and BMW, we're kind of everybody's darling, right? We're welcome in China, we're welcome in Europe, we're welcome in the US, and I don't think that's an asset that we should be giving up very quickly. But at the same time, of course, wake up and smell the coffee, right? There is a fundamental change, so we need to be doing more risk management and then going deeper into our value chains and then de-risking in terms of localization.
Yeah, and I think looking into all the news from the IAA and trying to make this very practical, the iX3 is an interesting example now. And yesterday I've read about how you build circularity into this from a design perspective and different examples. Can you share a little bit about the Neue Klasse, the iX3, and how you move that new strategic paradigm into something very practical, a new approach to a new class of vehicles?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's the nice thing. You can talk a lot about circularity, but ultimately in an industry like the automotive, you make it tangible and you can touch it because we're product driven, right? And the Neue Klasse is a new architecture, it's a new family of cars, but it's also a technology cluster. And if you want to design a car to be circular, it can't be an afterthought, right? You can't have the car on the market and say, oh, now I'd like to be using secondary materials. You need to do it from the very beginning when you are in the concept phase, when you're designing the vehicle. So we have very much a philosophy secondary first, and we also have the philosophy design for circularity. Make things simple so that you can take them apart, use secondary raw materials. And just to give you one example, and I think this makes it tangible and easy to understand, for the BMW iX3, which is the first Neue Klasse model, 1/3 of the car is secondary, and that amounts to about 740 kilos. So over 700 kilos of that vehicle is secondary and has been used somewhere else. And that applies to the aluminum, but it also applies to the battery cell. 50% of the lithium, cobalt, and nickel is already secondary. And that, if you do it properly, and I think we get to this probably later, it's checking so many different boxes, right? You're reducing CO2, you're reducing logistic chains, you're reducing the risks from mining, you're only having to do that once. If you do it properly, you're saving money. So those are just some of the examples, but you need to think about it at a very early stage to make it happen.
Thank you. And I think I could imagine that that's also challenging quite fundamentally in organization. from a strategy dimension, how you do stress testing, from a functional dimension, how you actually purchase, because I think the typical suppliers of secondary material are not the same as those for primary material. And then also from a R&D perspective, you need to release some of the hard principles you had in previous generations of the cars. How difficult was that from an organizational perspective?
Well, the corporate answer would be everybody at BMW loves sustainability, so it was a walk in the park, right? But I think the reality is, of course, you need to be convincing, right? Because business has been linear for the longest time. We harvest and then we use and then we throw it away. And often there is the question, well, do we need to be doing this? Is the regulator forcing us to do this? This costs a lot of money. Will the customer honor it? Is the customer willing to pay sustainability? So it is a lot about persuasion, and ultimately, something like this needs to be bottom up and top up, and there's a lot of leadership in the board of management as well to say, even if there's discussion and different opinions, at some point in time you need to say, no, let's do it, we're going in that direction. And we're hoping that our customers will honor it, right? Because if it's a business case and there's a premium for it, that makes it much easier.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So now we talked, I think, already 15 minutes about the topic of circularity. And we didn't mention the word sustainability a lot so far, which is, I think it's good, and it's showing a lot that we're talking about this thing from a different dimension now as well, from a perspective of de-risking. And still, if we would have Johan Rockström here today with us, he would remind us that already 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries are transgressed, and that the growing global resource consumption is driving a lot of the planetary crisis that we have: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. And I think we need pioneers in industries who go ahead and try to build circularity into their operating model. But also we need a more systemic answer. And I was thinking about this from a systems perspective. It's great that we have pioneers moving ahead, but what's the perspective from you, from the foundation, to get to a system-level solution that can work here?
Yeah, well, thank you first and foremost for having me. I'm a DLD newbie and very happy to be here. I think this is a conversation of the day, if not the conversation of the month, the year, many years to come. The first thing I'm going to do is to really break down what system thinking means in the most layman terms possible, because I think oftentimes you get caught up in this slightly abstract academic exercise. So at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the reason we are interested in the circularity of critical minerals is for a couple of reasons. And the way we apply system thinking to the circularity of critical minerals, first and foremost, is to think about the way we can talk about circularity of critical minerals across the broader society, so that engages many, many different stakeholders and get to that level of systemic collaboration. So I completely agree with the importance and the timing of the title of this panel today. But the title, if you look at it quite closely, we're thinking about circularity as a strategic response. And I think when you start to think about circularity in a reflexive, visceral way, you miss out on some of the other stories that we can be telling about circularity. And so one thing that Kerr mentioned earlier is the geographical presence of some of these mining and refining activities. But one thing we also need to remember, that Kerr also mentioned as well, that I want to highlight here, is regardless of where these materials are coming from, we will have a supply and demand gap, full stop. And so circularity is not just about de-risking, it is a lot about that, and at Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we will never waste a good crisis. If this is the conversation, we will partake in the conversation. But it's also important to remember that circularity is about creating economic opportunities that is fundamentally necessary to drive the energy transition. We will not meet the climate targets without circularity. We will not have societal progress, we cannot build data centers without circularity. It is necessary, full stop. So that's the first way we look at systemic thinking, is to tie it not just to geopolitical or business or environmental lens, but to tie it to broader societal requirements as to why everyone must think about circularity. The second way we think about systemic thinking is to think across the whole value chain. So Kerr mentioned something earlier, how a lot of people in this space are shouting about mining. And right now, we're in this beautiful city of Munich, where there's another major event going on, which is IA Mobility. And if you go and look at the audience and the exhibitors of IVA mobility, you'll also realize that it's dominated by battery manufacturers, component manufacturers, and car makers. And so there is a requirement to look at, for example, if you were to look at the EV battery and the materials going into the EV battery, there's a requirement to look at it systemically, i.e., all the way from very upstream, from mining, all the way to very downstream, at exactly how that car is used, fleet management, and thinking about innovative business models like mobility as a service. So it's important to have everyone in the space, not just the miners in the miners conference, not just the battery manufacturers and the car makers in the car conference, but to really address circularity for critical minerals, you need to bring across the whole value chain, because what happens upstream influences what happens downstream, and the commercial downstream constrain the possibility upstream. So that's the other way we look at systemic thinking.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and I think that is really important, that we not look at this only from a material, from perspective of end of life and secondary material and trying to scale it up and recycle ourselves, from that risk, but to take it from a, design perspective already at the inception, at the right design decisions, like we've heard a bit earlier. So this sounds important and I think like a good vision. But what is missing? I mean, what was holding us back here on that movement, on the different levers that you outlined? What are the big topics that make it very hard from a systems perspective?
So if I really have to simplify, I think it's two things. I think it's number one, really being ambitious about how we creatively redesign society. And so let me just give one example. And as the world develops, a lot of middle-income countries that start to graduate towards middle-upper-income countries, inevitably, people are going to buy private cars. Hopefully, if they do, they buy BMW ones because they're great. But societies go through a slight valley of transition, where as GDP per capita goes up, people buy more cars. Not just a bit more, but as a society, exponentially more. Then they get to a point where the society becomes so wealthy, and there are areas of that society that is so densely concentrated, particularly in urban areas, that you then afford the kind of public transport that then allows people to have less cars per capita. I'm just roughly summarizing. There's a bit of complexity around this, but that's generally true for most societies. So we want the world to progress. We want people in different countries to have what we may have in Munich today. So inevitably, people are going to buy more cars. But one thing to remember is, while private cars will always be part of our lives, most cars in our lives sit in the garage 95% of the time. Utilization is low. What you're paying for is availability. What you're paying for is the certainty. What you're paying for is the luxury and the comfort of having your own car. What you're paying for is certain features that you want to see in mobility. What if we can redesign society such that the features that we prioritize can still be there when it comes to not just public transport, but shared transport? And fundamentally, it may take 10 years, 20 years, but with more advanced technology, connected mobility, there's a lot of business models out there that we can explore to make sure it's a win-win solution for both companies, society, and resources. So I think it's a lot of creative thinking that can happen upstream, downstream, midstream, everywhere. On collaboration, we like to innovate. Everyone thinks innovation is great for a capitalist society. The problem with innovation is you can innovate into infinity. And the problem with that is you don't have a convergence towards things that will allow you to scale. All big industries had convergence at some point to scale. And I think that's what we need to see more in the materials that use critical minerals.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's a bit moving towards also the fundamental needs of the society and how to actually address that. That is already where it starts. Glenn, Benedict, do you have a perspective on some of the fundamental also trade-offs that we are facing here?
There are many. I'm now wondering how I get BMW into that answer, which are the best cars. My life is one of pessimism and blood and tears and war and conflict. And I was just saying outside, I come here to recharge and regain some of the optimism. And when I hear that, the technology solutions that are out there and the possibilities to redesign society, it sort of gives me back some of that optimism. And then my professional deformity kicks back in. Because you see, let's talk about the favorite animal of the Munich Security Conference. It's an elephant, the elephant in the room. And that's something that is uncomfortable to mention, but it's right there for everyone to see. And you see, the uncomfortable truth in that whole discussion is that our adversaries, our competitors, have a clear long-term strategy. The Chinese Communist Party in the early 80s decided to give themselves 40 years to make the world dependent on them and their resources. Do you see a long-term strategy in the West? You know, on the one hand, there are people who say, let the market solve this. Do we really have faith in the ability of the market to make strategic decisions in the best interest of the collective? I'm not so sure. And then the other option is, let the government solve it. And do we really have faith in elected governments in the West to take uncomfortable decisions with high costs in the short term that will reduce these dependencies in the long term? I'm not so sure. What I was saying, Glenn, is not that, you know, it's wrong to make business in China. In fact, it's brilliant to earn money in China. It's great to have trade relationships. The more, the better. I think the problem starts when we talk about cluster risks. How much of your company's future, how much of your workforce are you staking on one particular market? And are there sort of knock-on effects for the overall society? And here, BMW isn't, I would say, a big problem. But many German and European companies are just hoping that the problem will go away. And if there is one other sentence that you remember from what I've been saying, in addition to the previous one, hope is a shit strategy. And just don't do it. It's my role to be the party pooper and to keep saying over and over again that we are aware of an enormous grey rhino running at us. And I think we're doing too little, and just to rely on the market or just to rely on the government are two insufficient strategies. If they come together, we still have a minor chance.
Okay. So let's start talking about the elephant. Yeah. I think there are two sides to this, and you need to be thinking about how has the elephant been behaving, right? How has China been actually doing industrial policy? China has been very strategic. China will openly admit they spent many years trying to copy the German car. They tried many years to copy the German internal combustion engine, but they were not successful because the prowess is something that you can't just copy. So they went into the area of new energy vehicles. And they took, like you said, a very comprehensive approach. That means develop the champions in terms of battery, have the competences in terms of the chemistry, do the mining, be prepared to leave China and do the mining and do the refining, establish the value chains. And then now we have a situation where China has a very strong position in terms of that. The question is, what is the European answer? The European answer can't be to say we're ignoring China or we're getting out of the market. Because, and I'll be very open, the Chinese market is probably the most competitive car market in the world. So if you're not competitive in China, you're not a global player, right? And the new products that the German OEMs are bringing onto the market, I think they are competitive. And that's driving a lot of things as well. So you can't ignore China, you have to be part of it. But the question is, what are we going to do from a European perspective, right? And I give one example. We had a referendum to build Irlbach-Straßkirchen, which is a highly modern battery assembly plant here in Bavaria. And at the end, after a ferocious debate, 70% of the inhabitants in the area said, okay, we're open for a factory, right? But it was very controversial. The question was, do you want to industrialize? Do we want to have another factory next door? Can you imagine the debate that we would have had if we wanted to open a mine in Bavaria? It's not going to happen. So we all want electric cars. We all want to be in these sleek vehicles. We want to enjoy that effortless gliding feeling of electric vehicles. But do we want to have the value chains? Do we want to have the mining? We're not even able to kind of, with European neighbors like Serbia, install that. So that is a big wake-up call, right? To taking a negative perspective on things. If we as Europeans don't start working on circularity, use the resources, use the critical minerals that we have, recycle them and use them, then we don't really have an opportunity. And China is one of the leaders when it comes to recycling, right? So they're setting the pace at an industrial level. That's why we just need to be bolder and we need to be more confident and not just start banning technologies. Because if you're going to ban the internal combustion engine and force people to be driving electric vehicles, that's not going to help and that's not strategic.
Thank you for that. So I think, and that's a very important point. And I was wondering, from a perspective of WRI or EMF, how do you look also into the systems lens and the elephant? I mean, I believe there is no solution working around that. So how to work with the elephant, find a solution together? What are the priorities that you see here?
Yeah, if I may build upon what has been just said, there's clearly a discrepancy between the political agenda and what's happening on the market. Neither are working very efficiently, as Benedict pointed out. But despite of US, European, Western politicians trying to push for greater diversification in the clean energy supply chain for several years now, but in reality, we see the concentration is getting worse, right? So what the political agenda is not causing a shift in the market. I think that just illustrates how important, especially in the Western kind of economic system, to make market economics work. That's when the shift will really happen. And that applies to diversification. It also applies to scaling circularity. So to your earlier question, what's needed to really make circularity scale? I think it's not sufficient if it's driven only by ideology, or if companies only do it for PR reasons or for regulatory compliance reasons, it's not enough. We have to find a way to make higher circularity a good business, attractive business. That's the only way for it to scale. And we can spend another half an hour discussing what's needed to make the economics work, but I think that is a key underlying condition to make it work, whether it's circularity or supply chain diversification.
Just to start on the note, because I think a lot of people in this audience are global. So firstly, I hail from the beautiful island of Taiwan. If anyone's not been there, go. We need the tourism right now. But as a Taiwanese person, geopolitics is our lived reality every day. I have to compartmentalize myself as a Taiwanese person from my work all the time. So I get exactly where Benedict's coming from. Now, unfortunately, geopolitical narratives is a necessary narrative. But at the same time, how much is circularity about this narrative as opposed to more scientific, economic narratives? Because as all of you may have experienced, a lot of you will have experienced, who is our allies, wherever you come from? Have you ever sat there and thought, actually, after that last election, I'm not so sure anymore, because there's somebody got elected in a certain country, I'm no longer sure who's our allies. Things change. And so when we look at global supply chain, and globalization is an inevitable force, you ask the average person on the street in any country, and most of the time they like it, they support it, they see the benefit of it. What I think is we need to have a slightly better heuristic of talking about what happens on the local level, what happens on the national level, what happens at the regional level, and what happens at the global level. I don't think it's realistic to think, let's take the case of the EV battery, that we're going to have an utterly complete end-to-end value chain, a circularity hub in every region of the world. I think we'll have to make concessions. There are certain things we'll be better at doing, and there are certain things that we need to work with our friends, friendshore, or build allyship in order for that to happen, for circularity to happen. But of course, geopolitics is important. That's not that mean we pretend every region in the world can be self-sustainable and drive circularity on their own. I don't think that's going to happen.
Absolutely. So it needs to be part of the next Munich Security Conference for sure, and a big topic.
Given that we have 4 minutes and 36 seconds, do you think I could have a two-finger answer to
Yes,
this?
please.
Yes.
Because I think what you said is absolutely right. And in my sort of opening answer, I did point out that we need new alliances. And sort of, if you look at the globe and you look at, for example, voting patterns in the UN, there were these great times when whatever we put out for a vote in the United Nations was voted in with 192 countries voting in favor, and the same 5 countries, Venezuela, Eritrea, sort of the axis of evil reloaded, voted no. What we have missed over the last 7 to 8 years is that out of these 5 countries have miraculously become 48. There are now 48 countries that are voting down everything that Western liberal democracies put in front of the UN. And there is a story behind that. We have let these countries down. We haven't included them in sort of, the benefits of globalization. We have created a system that is unfairly tilted against them, etc., etc. And those are the countries we need to look at when we talk about alternative value chains and supply chains, because we need to get them back. We need to get them back into our camp. We need to get them off the fence. And this is yet another aspect of geopolitics that I think we must not forget when we talk about circularity. It doesn't mean we need to become independent of China. All I'm saying is let's reduce cluster risks and let's try to get some of these countries back by working with them to create the resources we need.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think for Europe, it's also about picking and prioritizing its battle. Right? It's very hard to achieve energy independence, security, and the supply chain security at the same time. Yeah. Right? So there is a prioritization that's needed there.
But some of the incentives are aligned. So you can do things for very different reasons, and all the reasons may be true. Climate change, sustainability, strategic imperatives, great market forces.
And if I can just throw in one thing as well, ideally, electric mobility wouldn't be a divider, but it would be a connector, right? So if we're doing, as Europeans, mining initiatives in other countries, then we're using our standards, right, to be mining. And we have technology cooperations with these countries. We have maybe suppliers, end-tier suppliers that are investing in these countries. So ideally, you still have, and we're not going to give up on globalization, so quickly, ideally the industry and the automotive industry is still a connector, building bridges.
What we need is, you've lost control of this panel now.
Absolutely.
What we need is real globalization. So get these 48 countries to, receive the same kind of benefits that China and others have received. And I think there will be more stability in the system.
I love that. I love that discussion. That is perfect because it shows exactly what we need. A lot of discourse over this day for sure, and the next 2 days, absolutely, because it's not a simple answer. It's not a simple solution to move towards a more circular system. So thank you all for these rich contributions and for the diversity of perspectives. We have 1 minute left. I would like to use the opportunity still for a very short closing statement or takeaway or call to action that you have from this panel discussion towards the audience as we move into the next round of discussions.
Start? Okay. The case for circularity has never been stronger. Let's go for it.
I think in the world that we live in, collaboration can seem difficult, but it's absolutely essential, so collaborate.
Good circularity ticks all of the boxes. It's resilience, it's a business case, it's a customer value proposition, and it's just a lot of fun.
Don't ignore the elephant in the room.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you. Great.